Good morning, and welcome to the launch of the Military Balance 2015, the annual assessment of global military capabilities and defense economics from the IISS. Joining me to answer your questions today are James Hackett, Dana Allen, Brigadier Ben Barry, Douglas Barry, Virginia Comley, Toby Dodge, Nigel Inkster, Giri Rajendra, Nick Redmond, and Anakin Ringlis. This latest military balance is replete with facts, figures, tables, and maps, analyzing military organizations, inventories, and defense spending throughout the world. Specialist essays focus on directed energy weapons, which we assess are closer to service entry than ever before, U.S. military space systems, analyzing the challenge to U.S. space assets from a crowded space environment, and on the problems posed by hybrid warfare. Our wall chart this year focuses on Russian armed forces. The Military Balance 2015 again confirms the decline in European defense spending and the continued rise in Asian defense capabilities. Debate in Europe is about whether that decline can be allowed to continue given the increase in security challenges in Europe and in Europe's near abroad. The discussion in Asia is about ensuring that the economic growth that supports military modernization remains the core national objective, so that countries will be self-deterred from allowing tensions to escalate to military conflict. While in early 2014, the concern was about possible military conflict in Asia, the salient strategic reality of the year was the re-emergence of conflict in Europe and the ever-complicating and widening nature of extreme Islamic terrorist groups' activity in the Middle East and Africa. The events in Europe over the last year, the events in Ukraine over the last year, and the erosion of virtually all trust between Western powers and Russia have challenged the post-Cold War European settlement. Western countries are now having to devise a strategy that would need to be a whole-of-government strategy to deal with an apparently revisionist Russia. As Francois Aisbourg, the chairman of the IISS, states in an article in the current issue of Survival, the key components of that strategy would be dissuasion of Russian adventurism on EU or NATO territory, active support of the sovereignty of other European states, and a demonstrable readiness to be respectful of Russia's non-revisionist security interests. In the meantime, the way in which the Ukrainian crisis is handled will set the tone for how the broader relationship with Russia unfolds. Civilian suffering in Ukraine has been profound, with both sides employing conventional military tactics reflective not only of their share of military heritage, but also of the increasingly bitter nature of the combat. These tactics have included the widespread use of artillery rockets and shell fire during operations amidst civilian populations. The use of militias and volunteer battalions has raised questions over effective command and control, and will complicate, when the conflict finally abates, any disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration initiatives that may be needed. Present attempts at a political settlement appear unpromising. The military situation remains fluid, and therefore fixing ceasefire lines particularly challenging, even if there were a will of all parties to do so. It is not clear that the will is there. While the Europeans now seem focused on a ceasefire, the other parties, the separatists and the governments of Ukraine and Russia, are thinking more strategically and have entirely incompatible aims. President Poroshenko seems determined to ensure that Kiev's writ runs across the whole of eastern Ukraine and that it controls the entire southeastern border. He is not willing to cede a veto over foreign policy to Donbass. The Kremlin, by contrast, appears to desire a fractured Ukraine, unable to move beyond Russia's orbit and get closer to Western institutions. Whereas the Kremlin might be content for the Luhansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic to exist within their current borders, the separatists are not. They want to control all of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast to achieve a measure of economic viability, and they refuse to see their future in Ukraine. There are further economic considerations. Kiev has imposed a blockade on the breakaway republics, in effect obliging Moscow to support them. Ukraine seems unable to win on the battlefield or at the negotiating table, but its adversaries cannot force it to resume fiscal responsibility for the East. Finally, there is the issue that sparked the crisis, Crimea. Russia will not countenance returning it, but neither Kiev nor the West can accept annexation. If the crisis in eastern Ukraine is solved, Crimea will return to the fore. It is important for all parties that any settlement in eastern Ukraine does not prejudice their positions and interests regarding Crimea, and this further complicates the task of arriving at a political settlement in Donbass. Into this complex set of political considerations has been introduced the question of arms to Ukraine. The German government considers that there is no amount of arms that the West might give Kiev that would not potentially be matched by Russian support to the separatists, and that therefore arms shipments to Kiev are not the answer. A growing body of opinion in the US Congress considers that the US has a moral and a strategic duty to provide Ukraine with increased means to defend itself. Others consider the option of arming Ukraine has at least to be kept on the table in support of the diplomatic process to end or at least freeze the military conflict. Throughout this crisis, Russia has shown its determination to use force and support the use of force by others in Ukraine. Military modernization in Russia is continuing with investment in new ships, combat aircraft, and guided weapons. Russia continues to test the Sukhoi T-50 fifth-generation fighter aircraft and may be finalizing designs of a new long-range bomber. Russia has nuclear weapons very much at the center of its military strategy, and there is increased emphasis on its rapid reaction forces, while its air and maritime capabilities are often being deployed provocatively. Overall, Europe is facing a more belligerent Russia that appears intent on testing the resolve of the West. European defense spending continued the decline seen since the 2008 financial crisis, and was in 2014 cumulatively 8% lower in real terms than in 2010. There were signs that the more challenging strategic environment was shifting budgetary priorities, particularly in Northern and Eastern Europe, and amid unease about possible gaps in NATO's capacity to counter Russia's use of hybrid warfare techniques. However, defense allocations in Europe's leading military players maintained their downward slide. Military equipment across the continent also continued to reduce, with policymakers focusing instead on the advanced capabilities of future kit. Numbers have declined substantially since the Cold War. Between 1995 and 2015, main battle tank numbers in Europe dropped from around 25,000 to just under 8,000, while fighters and ground attack aircraft decreased from 5,400 to 2,400. Appeals from the NATO Secretary General, including most recently at the Munich Security Conference for member states to meet the pledge to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, continue to be made. That goal will not be met soon. NATO has nevertheless agreed to enhance its NATO response force from 13,000 to 30,000 troops and signal its intent to become more agile. There will soon come a point when NATO declaratory policy on enhanced and more rapidly deployable forces to preserve the current security order will require increased investment by NATO members or a new burden-sharing agreement between them. While a revisionist Russia has challenged the European security order, the threat from extreme Islamic terrorists strengthened during the year. The rise of Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, ISIS, and the flow of jihadists in and out of various Middle Eastern theaters of war has become a major preoccupation for European states. Intelligence services have to concentrate heavily on the threats posed to European societies by returning jihadists. Military successes on the part of ISIS galvanized a US-led coalition into launching airstrikes against the jihadi movement in Iraq and also in northern Syria. The hybrid nature of ISIS, part insurgency, part light infantry, part terrorist group, proved key to its advances. Its campaigns in Iraq and Syria have shown ISIS to be an adaptable adversary, demonstrated by its tactical adjustment in late 2014 to reduce vulnerability to coalition air power and ISR capacities. Since launching an air campaign against ISIS in August 2014, the US-led Operation Inherent Resolve has met with mixed results in both Iraq and Syria. The strategy of giving extended air support to local allies has certainly played a part in breaking the strategic momentum that ISIS created through the summer of 2014. In Iraq, coalition air power was crucial in the retaking of Mosul Dam in August, as well as defending Erbil, the capital of the Kurdish regional government, from an ISIS onslaught. Iran also provided air support to Iraq. In Syria, the heavy use of air power proved decisive in the defense of the Kurdish city of Kobani. Still, the US Pentagon had to acknowledge in late January that the total gains made against ISIS in Iraq add up to only 1% of the territory it holds in that country. It is clear that American allies on the ground, the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Iraqi army, and the Free Syrian Army, are not yet strong enough, in spite of US weapon supplies, training, and air support, to win sustainable victories against ISIS. The upcoming push to retake Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, will be a decisive test of whether President Obama's strategy of giving extended support to proxy forces on the ground can defeat as opposed to contain ISIS. It is likely that long-term training and support for both Syria's non-ISIS rebels and Iraq's security forces and broader government institutions will be required. That support will need to be combined with sustained political efforts to regain the trust of Iraq's Sunni community. Coalition air operations may lead to tactical victories against ISIS, especially when they enable progress by fighters opposed to it, but they cannot inflict strategic defeat on the group. Military methods alone cannot successfully tackle the sophisticated means that ISIS uses to recruit and inspire its followers and sustain its operations. Countering ISIS's information operations, designed in equal measure to intimidate and open seams in the coalition, will also require lasting, again, whole of government and multilateral attention. Complex security dynamics across the region meant that regional defense spending was already high, but growing insecurity and conflict have contributed to a further acceleration. Spending remains focused on air defense and strike systems, particularly in the Gulf, though some states have invested in rotary wing, airlift, and tanker capacities, as well as armor and artillery. In 2011, average real defense spending growth in the Middle East and North Africa region was 3.5%. In each year since, we estimate it has increased by an average of 10%. In contrast to the continuing decline evident in Europe, overall defense spending has increased in Asia since 2010 by more than a quarter in nominal terms, growing to more than US $340 billion in 2014. China's defense spending continues to outpace its neighbors' efforts. In 2010, China accounted for around 28% of the Asian total. By 2014, its share had increased to around 38%. In contrast, Japan's share of regional military outlays fell from 20% in 2010 to just less than 14% in 2014. China's military procurement program, supported by these budget increases, continues to attract attention. Following a flurry of new naval programs from the Liaoning carrier to destroyers, more are underway. Armament has also improved. The 60 frigates and destroyers in service in 2000 had less than 600 anti-ship and surface-to-air missile cubes between them. The current fleet has almost triple that number, with only 20% more hulls. The November 2014 Zhuhai Air Show provided further insights into China's military progress. Highlights of the show included the FC-31 combat aircraft prototype, which might be intended for export, a large ramjet-powered supersonic anti-ship missile design, the CX-1, and a range of air-to-surface weapons being offered for use on UAVs. Japan, too, has increased its defense budget and continues to boost its military capabilities. Tokyo's defense plans include acquisition of F-35s, tilt-rotor aircraft, and an expanded submarine fleet, including the advanced Soryu class. This boat's advanced propulsion offers a substantial increase in the time a submarine could spend submerged at sea. Australia is assessing the Soryu class as a possible replacement for its existing submarines. The submarines remain a key requirement for states across Asia. Vietnam has started to receive its Kilo-class boats from Russia, and India, South Korea, Indonesia, and Singapore are also upgrading their submarine forces. The West would still spend more than half of global defense outlays in 2014, though this was down from 2/3 of global totals in 2010. Given this trend, and even though some states have marginally increased their defense efforts amidst heightened security concerns, European states will have to more seriously weigh the optimum balance between their defense ambitions, deficit reduction, and discretionary spending, such as military outlays. In contrast, emerging economies have continued to escalate their defense spending. In 2014, these increases more than offset Western reductions. Overall, real global defense expenditure in 2014 rose by 1.7% after 3 years of reductions. However, this trend may moderate this year in light of falling oil prices, the stagnation of the Russian economy, and slowing global growth. Of course, military spending is only part of the picture. Military capability, like that of the US, still the world's largest defense spender, relates to more than simply the equipment a state might procure. It also relates to the quality of personnel and decades of accumulated military training and operational experience. Factors like these inform a more rounded assessment of a country's military capability. So while defense investment gaps are closing, Western states with global defense ambitions must try to retain that accumulated experience, mindful that once a capability is lost, it is very hard to rebuild. Additionally, Western states will look to retain a technological edge while attempting to minimize the risk to their military power from the diffusion of previously select technologies to a broader range of state and non-state actors. This time last year, we highlighted the challenge to defense planners from a fractured and complex security environment. As we enter 2015, this state of affairs is more threatening. Insecurity, violence, and the use of military force are all increasing. The so-called arc of instability is widening, and military crises do not seem to end, but rather multiply. Meanwhile, armed forces remain involved not just on traditional military tasks, but also on missions as wide-ranging as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and pandemic response. These missions remain global in scope and complex in execution. So as policymakers grapple with these issues, the 2015 edition of the Military Balance, we think, still provides the best available public information on military capabilities, trends, and defense expenditure across the world. The facts and analysis concerning national military capabilities contained in the Military Balance, we expect will help significantly to inform discussions within government and the wider public debate. And all of us here look forward to the questions on this statement and on the content of this year's Military Balance 2015. Thanks very much. Who would like to go first? Yes, you, sir. Could you give us your name? The microphone will come to you right now. It's coming to your left.
Thank you very much. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about the future of Islamic states. In my view, they have made a lot of enemies. At the same time, they spread their franchise everywhere in the world. How do you evaluate the future of Islamic states and the threat? It will be down or up in short term and mid term and long term.
Toby Dodge.
I think I would divide that question into the territory that it currently holds in Syria and Iraq, the wider region, and then Europe and beyond. I think it's certainly in Iraq. I think ISIS, although it has not been pushed back very far, has probably reached the territorial extent of its own capacity, and we can see both the Peshmerga and the Kurdish regional government and slowly and very haphazardly the Iraqi government and its allied militias containing and pushing back. In Syria, I think it's not only the Syrian government, it's its own jihadi rivals, specifically Jabhat al-Nusra, which are putting limits on it. But of course, the security services across Europe are deeply worried about what would we call the trade in jihadi tourists returning from Syria and Iraq, and with comparative geographical ease. Now, beyond that, you mentioned the franchise, and I think this is fascinating. The franchise is more about demonstration effect and learning from the hybrid approach of ISIS. And one wonders if it's put on the back foot and constrained within the Middle East, whether it can develop a franchise network in anything like the extent that Al-Qaeda managed off the back of the Afghan campaign. So I think the threat is certainly profound in Europe. It's constrained in Syria and Iraq, but is expanding in the wider Middle East region.
Yes?
Hi, Dominic Dudley, freelance journalist. On Sunday, the French Foreign Minister confirmed that the $3 billion worth of Saudi-funded French arms that are going to Lebanon are going to go ahead as of April. I wonder what the appetite is, in your view, amongst Gulf governments to keep paying for these sorts of things to support the likes of Lebanon and perhaps Jordan, and the appetite of Western governments to supply those arms.
Well, I think the Gulf governments very powerfully feel that they've been forced to step into a vacuum, whether actual or perceived by the Obama's much more modest foreign policy in the region off the back of Afghanistan and Iraq. I think, though, that certainly Saudi, but also the United Arab Emirates, very ambitious regional policy has realised its limits. And that limit is not in Lebanon, intriguingly, or Jordan. It's the bottomless pit of Egypt. So I suspect Gulf regional power ambition has been contained, and it's rather optimistic projection of power into the post-Arab Spring. Non-oil producing states has also now been limited because of the costs and the lack of capacity.
Yes.
Basic, is this working? Yes. Question which is on The Guardian about Ukraine. You talk about the incompatible aims of Kiev on the one hand and Russia on the other. How do you see the crisis panning out?
Nick Redmond?
Difficult to see it panning out. We'll have to wait and find out what happens for Minsk too. But the incompatibility, the incompatibility is around really the nature, not the question not of ceasefire, but of what happens after the ceasefire. So the nature of the Ukrainian state, whether it's to be a unitary state in which Kiev's grid runs right across the country, or whether it's to be some sort of confederal arrangement, something rather more like Bosnia. And that's where the incompatibility arises, because Yanukovych isn't prepared to cede anything significant to these rebels that he's what he's minded to do. Russia, on the other hand, is quite keen to fracture Ukraine in this way, to make sure that it's not really a viable entity, not one that can make a successful transition or move forward. And the separatists actually want more territory because they understand that they're not viable. And that's why I think we need to focus on the fact there's three parties rather than two. It's not simply Ukraine and Russia. The separatists have certainly been supported by Moscow, but at times I suspect they would also have felt exploited by them.
Yes.
Thank you. Ashraf Saad, Sky News Arabiya. We read in this report, or here this report is talking about the increasing of military spending because of ISIS, or what we call Daesh in Arab world. Would we expect in the future to see the military spending of ISIS itself?
Yeah, in the military balance we focus mainly on states, so we don't actually look at ISIS itself. But in terms of what's driving military spending in the Middle East, I would say yes, it's partly Daesh, but actually the spending increases have really occurred since 2011, since the Arab Spring. So you have a 3.5% increase in 2011, but every year subsequent to that, you've had a 10% real increase in spending, right? So is that going on sort of interior security, internal security things, as well as, you know, your big ticket procurement items that you're using against Daesh? You know, it's both things, the Daesh threat, but also internal security elements.
Toby?
Yeah, just to agree with Gary, that I think military spending is in spite of ISIS, not necessarily because of it. Now, ISIS' own military spending is quite fascinating because as they have conquered and held on to territory, their oil, the money they get from oil smuggling, anti-smuggling and racketeering has had to spread a great deal wider. And so the initial bounce they got from seizing all the US supplied weapons to the Iraqi army after the collapse of Mosul is now being reduced because they have to deliver some meaningful support to the populations they're holding. So in fact, I think we'll see a shrinking of the money they can spend on armaments as their own ability to smuggle oil has come under close scrutiny from the UN amongst others. So I think we're going to see a reduction in their military budget.
I'm Chris Jasper from Bloomberg. In terms of the Ukraine conflict, how much of a full-blown effort do you feel is being made by the Ukrainian forces to subdue the separatists? Or is there a sense that they are, at the moment, trying to rein themselves in for fear of provoking Moscow? And therefore, in terms of what armaments might be supplied by the US or others, what do they really need? I think you said that that Russia would easily match whatever they might be supplied with, but is there really an arms deficit there for Ukraine, or is it really that they are not, at the moment, off the leash?
Ben Barry.
I don't think there's any lack of resolution on the part of the Ukrainian forces. When they've been fighting the separatists on their own, that is the separatists without apparent Russian support, they've made progress against them, albeit in the way that John described. Why are they falling back now? Well, it seems to me that firstly the Ukrainian Air Force is neutralised by layered air defences over rebel territory, and that their superior reconnaissance supporting the separatists, for example, signals intelligence and UAVs, and the government forces are overmatched by electronic warfare and firepower, especially artillery, which is all making it difficult for them to concentrate and move, as well as imposing casualties. And we saw this in the way they were forced out of the airport. But part of the issue is that the Ukrainian forces at the start of the war were less modernised and less well trained than the Russian forces. And of course the pro-government militias, even less so. So the implication is that if weapons were to be supplied to the Ukrainian forces, they ought to be weapons of the type they already have. But remember, Ukraine had a large indigenous arms industry, and there's no evidence that they've actually been running out of their own arms. Now, what I hear are pleas for advanced precision weapons, which would take time for them to be trained. And the issue is, if the US were to announce the supply of arms to Ukraine, what would be the Russian reaction? Well, it seems to me they could declare that they were overtly now supplying weapons and material to the separatists, so their behaviour would be even less constrained. And they can introduce additional military support much more quickly than any conceivable external supply of arms to Ukraine, in my view. So if the US and other nations chose to supply Ukraine, it would take some time to tip the military balance in their favour, and could probably be overmatched by a more rapid Russian escalation.
Yes.
Marshall Dartney, Statesman. What evidence do you have of Qatari financial support to Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab?
I think the answer is none. I mean, that's not, we don't have evidence. It's not something discussed in Northern Balance, and it's not something that we see any proof of. Yes, John.
Jonathan Marcus, BBC. More parochial question. Britain is one of the countries that's struggling to maintain the 2% commitment on its defence spending. With the election coming up, is Britain approaching a strategic parting of the ways? Is it as dramatic as that? Will constraints on defence spending mean we have to change very much the strategic outlook that we have the future?
Ben Barry?
Well, it's difficult not to answer yes. Jimmy Rajendran in a moment can give you his best assessment on the economic dimension of that. But quite clearly, if defence spending were to take a further reduction, it would be increasingly difficult to sustain the force structure that there is at the moment and is planned for the future.
There was one here. Yes.
Hi, Sam Jones, Financial Times. Just to follow up on that question, what will the outlook for the UK be in terms of spending compared to European countries and globally? And second question, if I may, what's the outlook for the Russian defence budget, and is there any evidence yet of cuts or loss of capabilities to that, or in the near future as a result of the budgetary crisis in Russia?
Yeah, I'll ask Jerry Rajendran to answer that, but I just note that on page 21 there is a comparison of the top 15 countries in the world defence expenditure as at 2014, obviously listing the US first, followed by China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, UK, France, Japan, India, Germany, South Korea, comprising the top 10. But Jerry, would you like to add a few?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the UK and Europe, I mean, in Europe you've seen real reductions in Europe occur at about 2% per annum. It's about 8% down from 2010. So that's roughly comparable to what the UK has done to the budget over that same period. On the 2% target, it's a bit of a moving benchmark, because you've got the GDP figures, and UK GDP growth is growing now at about, on average, 2.5%. I think the IMF projection is up to 2019. So there should, in theory, be room for maneuver here. The question really is on what degree of political prioritization defense has relative to deficit reduction. I think the initial coalition plan was for the deficit to be completely eliminated in a few months' time when the financial year starts. Obviously, things haven't panned out that way. It's been pushed back, I think, to 2018. So in order to plug, you've got $100 billion or so, or sorry, £100 billion or so to make up. The question is, do you spread this over a longer period of time and then leave some fiscal space for defense, or do you choose to prioritize budgetary consolidation instead? So just broadening it slightly, that was in the UK. In the context of Europe, just on the global picture, we say that global spending overall rose this year, but the composition of the increases and reductions around the world is quite interesting. You see very large increases in principally Saudi Arabia, China, and Russia, and in fact the increases there actually outweigh the reductions in the rest of the world. So some quite interesting pictures in terms of the composition of spending globally as well.
Anyone else want to add anything? Ben?
I did not give Jonathan enough traction on that question, which relates to sound as well. The UK is a good example. An overall 9% reduction in defence expenditure as a result of the SDSR took out about 20 to 30% of conventional capability overall, and some key capabilities were deleted, such as maritime patrol aircraft. Now, that's because the UK, like many Western European countries, have professional armed forces that spends a lot of money on paying them and a lot of money on training them. So if there were another significant reduction of UK defence, it would cause, again, a disproportionate reduction in the conventional force structure, because the same factors would apply, and much of the inefficiencies have been taken out as part of meeting the SDSR targets.
Sorry. Next, there, and then we'll come back.
Yes, so Naito, the Japanese Sankei News. My question is regarding the Asian situation. As you pointed out, China is increasing the military budget, and while the Japanese, well, not last year, but has a significant decrease. And you mentioned the hybrid warfare, even in Asian theater. Is there any suggestions what should be done to tackle with this kind of hybrid warfare in Asian theater, if one was to use? Thank you.
Does anyone want to take that? Hybrid warfare in Asia? Nigel?
I think we're looking at something rather different from what we've been seeing in either the Middle East or in Eastern Europe at the moment. I think that, it seems to me that all the indications in Asia suggest that concepts of warfare are going to be primarily focused on the conventional approach, and that's certainly where China is coming from. If we look at Chinese development of capabilities overall, they seem very much still to be influenced by RNA type considerations. Now, obviously, there are certain areas, and cyber is the obvious one to highlight, where China has made it abundantly clear that they would be willing and intend to use cyber capabilities in the event of any conflict, and see that as a way to shape the battle space and to influence and possibly degrade the will of a potential opponent to fight. The thinking is very much, actually analogous with Western concepts of how to do this, and it's not. And I think that in the main, for all the talk of Sun Tzu and all this stuff, my sense is that in the main, Chinese concepts of cyber warfare are actually very derivative from Western ones. I think if we look at, for example, what's happening, if we want an example of something that comes close to hybrid warfare, we might look at what's happening in the South China Sea, where what China is doing is creating facts on the ground using non-military capabilities, fishing protection, this sort of thing, creating facts on the ground, producing a somewhat more emollient public narrative, which appears to be entirely tactical and doesn't change anything strategic.
John, can I just add a little word on that? I mean, I agree with what Nigel's saying, but I think one of the things we do talk about in the book this year is the lessons that the states, non-state actors around the world might draw from hybrid warfare. We don't necessarily say what they are, but I think it's notable in the Japanese context that within the last year there has been talk of grey zone contingencies. And what that means, I suppose, is use of forces short of armed conflict, and what that could mean in terms of reaction, response, what states would do in enacting military objectives or taking military objectives, as well as how states would react to that. So I think there is concern in the longer term over what it could mean for a military situation in other parts of the world. Although I think Nigel's right, the fact is that currently it's slightly different.
Yes? You stand up, please. Thank you.
Hi, Kyle Lark, BFBS, British Forces broadcaster. I'm just wondering what you think the single biggest threat to Britain will be this year. Is it likely to be a cyber attack or jihadists returning back to the UK, a homegrown attack, and how should our military be preparing for that?
Ben Barry.
The one that's most likely to cause loss of life, in my view, is the threat of either returning jihadists or self-starting lone wolves attempting to do a repeat of Mumbai or the Charlie Hebdo. Now, quite clearly, the response to that should be led by intelligence, both the security service and the police. And the response in the first case would be the police. And we've heard that the government's doing a rapid stocktake of the army of the police force. I would commend the French security forces for their response to those two different terrorist incidents and the way that they handled them. They seem to have a well-rehearsed ability to call in helicopters, for example, and I think there are some tactical issues, for example, having to search a large wood or operations in rural areas, or indeed having to call in, say, a large railway station, for which the police might rapidly run out of manpower. And I think the government will probably turn to the armed forces to help with that, and I would hope there are prudent conversations and prudent planning and exercises going on. Nigel might have something to say on the causes of jihadism in the UK.
I don't dissent from what Ben said. That's the obvious way in which loss of life is most likely to occur. And it remains the case that within the cyber domain, nobody's ever demonstrably died as a result of anything that's been done within that domain. I mean, cyber attacks cyber intrusions, hostile intrusions by both state and non-state actors are a reality, and the intensity of those attacks appears to be increasing. There was a major report last year, I think, by McKinsey, I may be misattributing here, that said, in the last year in the United Kingdom, the actual overall number of recorded hostile cyber attacks, mainly focused against the private sector, had actually reduced, but the damage done by and the costs arising from those attacks had actually increased quite significantly. I think there's a general expectation that that trend will continue, but it may well be something that never really sees the light of day, not least because, of course, not all cyber attacks are registered, not all cyber attacks are reported, and it's almost impossible reliably to put any kind of figure on the damage and costs of this kind of activity. So it's something that's going to be going on all the time, but whether it will make headlines is a moot point.
Any can take Rita?
Yeah, just to build on Nigel point, I think cyber we need to anticipate to see as an aspect and element of both conventional operations and as a self-standing, separate threat. And that is also what we can read from studying the recent approaches to developing military cyber capabilities, which take both forms. On the one hand, integrating cyber into a full range of military operations, but then on the other hand, developing niche capabilities that are aimed at better exploiting the cyber domain. So I would say that we will see cyber in its various incarnations, such as in Ukraine, we're seeing again information operations, but also fewer cyber attacks against websites. So it comes in a variety of forms.
Just coming back to the statement in the new statesman, I don't know whether, Virginia, you want to say anything about how Boko Haram is supported.
Yes, sure. Yeah. I can certainly do that. I haven't seen any evidence of Qatari, for instance, supporting Boko Haram. But Boko Haram does receive funding from a number of sources. They also rely very heavily on criminal activity, bank robberies, for instance, and really allow the group to stay alive alongside kidnapped for ransom, both of foreigners, but also of Nigerian nationals. In the earlier days of Boko Haram, they also received funding from wealthy Nigerian business people and possibly high-ranking politicians from northern states in Nigeria. This has continued up until, we say, 2009, 2010, and when really the group turned into the monster that we are seeing today. And I guess at that point, a number of politicians realized that this was no longer a game, and they had to leave Boko Haram alone. There have been also some details or some evidence of funding arriving from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, for instance, and but I think HRM is actually under quite a lot of pressure, starting from the French operation in Mali, and up to this day, so it's no longer in such a strong position to provide funding and support to other groups. But I think nowadays Boko Haram is quite efficient at fundraising itself.
Sorry, the time to go with the next one. Yes, you go back there. Yeah. We'll come back to you.
Along of TASS agents of Russia, what is your forecast for the conflict in the East Ukraine? Is it the military victory is achievable for either side, or could it be an escalation of conflict? For example, Ukraine will get arms from the United States, or is ceasefire possible, and what is needed for this ceasefire to be viable?
Well, Nick, do you want to take a second shot at answering that same question?
I'd say the question of ceasefire it's not just a ceasefire, it's what happens with the ceasefire. The Minsk agreement is basically dead now. It's dead because there was no sequencing, it didn't really meet the interests of the parties, or it was so open to interpretation it was simply not possible. But I find it very difficult to make a forecast. As an analyst, I look at the incompatibility of the aims, and it's clear to me that something has to give. One thing actually, by the way, coming back to the Guardian question, is actually on Western policy. I think it's reasonable to assume that Russia is going to want an explicit guarantee about Ukraine not being in NATO. Now this is a very difficult thing for Western states to countenance, because the position up to now has been decisions that reside with NATO or with NATO partners are not subject to third-party consent. Now that's obviously not tenable in a case where Russia demands as a condition a guarantee over NATO.
Yes, please. Hello, this is second row.
Carlotta Livio, China Daily Europe. Shifting back to East Asia, my question relates to whether or not do you have evidence of China's defense spending, military spending, as having become more transparent in order for the region to avoid falling into an arms race? And the second question, if I may, it's planned, the Chinese government has planned for September this year a military parade in the center of Beijing, and it's going to be the first one not held on October 1st to celebrate the founding of the PRC. It's going to be celebrating the end of World War II. And my question in relation to this is, is this a mere exercise of power projection for a domestic audience? Meaning, is this just something that Xi Jinping does for his domestic audience, or will this lead to a shift in foreign policy strategy in East Asia for China? Thank you.
That's nice.
Okay, well, to pick up your second point, I would make a general observation here that what we're seeing are signs of a more self-confident, assertive and proactive foreign policy generally by China, as China evolves economically and politically and militarily into a major power, arguably the second power after America. I think the particular semiotics of the parade that you referred to are a combination of internal and really are in a way an extension of the whole sort of patriotic education system that we have seen in China over the last 20 plus years, reinforcing this this particular narrative. I think it's also a reflection of the external dimension of Xi Jinping's China dream, which the more one looks at it, the more one thinks does actually focus on the external dimension, the idea that the aim is to establish or re-establish China as a major power, enjoying respect and influence in the world. So I think those are the main factors. On the defence expenditure, I think I might defer to Giri on the question of greater transparency, but obviously it's a general proposition that we've seen more of the back workings of Chinese defence budgets over the last few years, to a degree that generally still falls well short of what many in the West hope will be the case.
Giri?
Yeah, just to pick up on your first point on the transparency, we haven't really seen an improvement on that front. China really uses about 3 figures a year, and they vary from each other for about 5% each time. It's one of the least transparent countries in the world, and that's in a way quite worrying, simply because it's the second largest spender in the world. Many believe the research and development budget is not included in the official numbers, but obviously you have to estimate that. And this sort of lack of transparency really contributes to sort of planning in the region on a worst case scenario type basis, as Matt proved.
Yeah, I think you've been up for a while. Yes. And then we like
Philippe Bernard, Le Monde. You emphasized on the limits of the traditional military methods in order to tackle the IISS and the way of recruiting online to recruit jihadists. What do you think of what the Western and especially European states do in this field, and have you got figures about the evolution of the budgets spent on this field to try to create a counter narrative to recruiting jihadists? Thank you.
Nigel?
Yeah, I don't have any figures, to be quite honest. I think I would say that in the overall scheme of things, the sums of money spent by Western governments on counter-narrative are relatively small. And this is a contentious issue because it's an area where it's almost impossible to devise effective metrics to determine whether these programs are having any success. And it is very contentious, or potentially quite culturally contentious, when essentially non-Islamic governments are seeking to engage with and influence opinion within Islamic communities. I think within Europe, the extent to which this is being done varies. The United Kingdom has invested quite heavily in this. France, until recently, I think much less so, and certainly I think French counter-terrorism strategy has tended more to emphasize the hard rather than the soft security dimension. I think in the long term, probably what is much more interesting is what's starting to happen in areas of the Islamic world, picking up on General al-Sisi's al-Azhar speech on New Year's Day, which has been significantly underreported in the West, where he called for a religious revolution. Those are the exact terms. And it's quite clear that there is a head of steam in this regard that is being quietly and subtly built up by actually Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to promote a form of Islam that is, let us say, more compatible with expectations of the 21st century. If you look at al-Sisi's speech, he says it's inconceivable that the thinking we hold most sacred should cause the entire ummah to be a source of anxiety, danger, killing, and destruction for the rest of the world. The ummah is being torn, it's being destroyed, it's being lost, and it's being lost by our own hands.
Yes, you and then come back to you.
Beth Stevenson, Black Global. Regarding the Baltic air pollution mission that NATO is carrying out in Eastern Europe, how effective do you think this is as a deterrent to Russia? And do you anticipate that this may be ramped up in the coming months or years, or do you think it's reached its limit in terms of effectiveness?
Then Barry?
Well, it's clearly had some effect. I mean, the three Baltic states still are independent and not being substantially threatened by Russia the way Ukraine has. It's been reinforced, it's going to continue. I think, though, there is a wider military question about NATO's commitment to the Baltic states. What we saw last autumn was increased NATO exercises in Poland, the Baltic states, and for that matter in southeastern Europe and the Black Sea, to reassure NATO's frontline states, for want of a better word, who felt more threatened as a result of Ukraine. NATO has now decided that it will ramp up its ability to react, including increasing the size of the NATO response force and creating this so-called very high readiness spearhead force. NATO is also putting what they call NATO force integration units into 6 of the frontline states, including the 3 Baltics. Now, this will certainly reassure those states and has an element of deterrence against Russia. But my worry is that without more NATO presence in terms of more regular exercises and also more forces on the ground in Eastern Europe, the deterrence is not great. And if Russia decided to move against, for example, a Baltic state, it could do so very quickly and present a fait accompli that would then require a NATO reaction force and indeed some very hard strategic judgment calls. Now, quite clearly, NATO is an alliance of 28 states. It's consensual, and it doesn't want to unnecessarily worry Russia about it being an aggressive alliance. But what NATO has announced, if tested, the risks could show quite early on.
Barry?
I just add, Beth, that I think it's as much about reassurance as it is deterrence. I think it's about offering reassurance to the countries of the region. The figures that NATO gave out at the end of January suggested 400 intercepts in 2014. That's about 3 times as many as in 2013, and I would imagine that an awful lot of those are as a result of the Baltic Air Policing operation. I think we'll also be interested to watch what happens with Nordefco. I mean, the Swedes are beginning to talk up much closer cooperation, so we'll be interested to see if that actually leads to any developments in the air environment.
Thanks very much. Yes, you, right in the end.
Yeah, hi, Robert Wall with the Wall Street Journal. I wanted to go back briefly to Russia as well. I had 2 questions, one for Doug, one for Giri. For Doug, perhaps, what's your view right now on T-50 timeline and the bomber? And then on the budgeting side, if you look at 2015, what is military spending going to roughly come in Russia as a percentage of GDP, do you think? And you know, Moscow's made comments there. This is not an area they're going to cut back, even if their own revenues are dwindling. But how long is this level of spending sustainable if oil stays below $80 a barrel or something?
Doug?
Robert, on T-50, I'd stick to my kind of guess that it's going to be about an IOC of about 2020, realistically. And they say they're going to get the first production standard aircraft about 2016. If that happens, you think a genuine squadron workup isn't going to be much before the end of this decade. On the bomber, on Pak-Da, I think we're both old enough to remember T-60. How long did that kick about? We never actually saw a model of it. So they talk about an aircraft in the mid-2020s, first flight. That strikes me as very optimistic, depending on the funding line. So again, you know, it's how long's a piece of string, unfortunately, in the bomber. Giri?
Yeah, on the spending side, on the Russian, I think in 2014 it jumps. I think 2013 it's at 3.15% of GDP, and it jumps to almost just under 3.5% of GDP in 2014, so quite a large increase. And I think the idea was to just ramp up the state defense order in 2015 before it sort of tails off in 2016 and 2017. So that's on the percent of GDP numbers. On average, Russian defense spending has increased over the last 4 years at about 8% in real terms per annum, a very considerable increase every year since about 2008 after the Georgian conflict. Whether that's sustainable, you've got falling oil prices, economic stagnation at home, but if you think about it, I mean, the decline in the oil price is about 50% fall. The fall in the ruble has been equivalent to that, something like that, as a result of sanctions. So these things offset each other. If you're earning hard currency and it's 50% less than it was, but your currency, if you're converting it into rubles, it's getting you twice what it used to get. From a budgetary perspective, these things look like they offset each other a little bit. So the pressure is not all on the downside. There is some room for maneuver here. Having said that, the banking sector is very fragile. They're having to inject funds from the sovereign wealth funds to that, and some of that's being channeled through the Russian budget, the 2014 budget itself. So shoring up the banking sector is going to remove fiscal space for other areas of government spending. And so I think they announced 2 weeks ago that they're going to ring-fence defense. How long that's sustainable in light of cuts elsewhere remains to be seen, I'd say. Thanks.
Right at the very back, yes?
Of a clear American strategy towards Daesh and the limited resource allocation to the air campaign and the imbalance in the force in the region. How long does it take for that in its own sword? And if that takes a long time, what is the regional and the regional impact and the impact on Western interests?
Toby Dodge.
Yeah, I'll tell you why I wouldn't put a timeline on it, because I don't think it's solvable in the foreseeable future. If we take each part of it in turn, I think the Syrian civil war seems to be reaching, if anything, a stalemate. Assad's going nowhere. I think the rebuilding of the Iraqi army is a work that will be in progress for most of our lives, I think. If you actually look at the vast amounts of money that was spent from 2004-05 onwards, trying to train and rebuild and re-equip the Iraqi army, only to see it collapse overnight in the summer of 2014. I don't think we invest much hope in its reconstruction rapidly over the next couple of years. And of course, in both Syria and Iraq, it's a truism that the conflict is driven primarily by political problems. So Daesh then becomes a symptom, not the cause. And although Hyderabadi, the new Iraqi prime minister, has not put a foot wrong, I think his messaging has been very good. I don't think he has much control over the Shia militias, the Quds Brigade of the Revolutionary Guard, or indeed the Iraqi street. So what he can actually deliver is minimal. So that's a very long-winded way of saying this conflict is going to run in Iraq and Syria over the next 5 to 10 years. And I suspect then, as we've seen with Saudi troop movements, the region then moves to contain it. And I think that's the great lesson the Gulf states have learned from the seizure of Mosul in the summer of 2014, that both Syria and Iraq need to be contained. If Turkey learns that lesson as well, then I think we're moving towards something of a sustainable situation.
Right in the front row here.
Grant Turnbull, Shepherd Media. I'm just wondering if the panel could tell me what they think the biggest threat to space assets are. I know you've mentioned that the report contains a section on space, and where those threats originate from, really looking at the increasing capabilities from China. So I wonder if maybe someone could explain that. And secondly, with regards to events in Ukraine, I wonder if Europe will be building its conventional forces again in terms of main battle tanks, artillery, if that's going to be an option, or will we see bespoke kit that's designed technologically to overcome a mass force?
Yeah, on space capacity, just remind you to look at pages 13 to 15 of the Military Balance today, where there's an essay on space systems. I don't know whether James or Doug wants to take that on. James?
I'll just say a few words and then maybe Doug can follow on. What the piece really talks about is how space is an increasingly crowded and congested environment. There are more spacefaring nations than ever before. That leads to more satellites, more debris, of course, after issues such as the ASAT test of a few years back. And as a result of that, military space assets are seen as increasingly vulnerable. Now, the US, for instance, has looked at reducing a reliance on large bespoke satellites by examining new distributed satellite architectures to reduce and dissipate risk, to reduce the reliance on large satellites also, and introducing systems to reduce interference, satellite systems that can do that as well as ground-based systems to track space debris. And also one of the things we've been looking at for a few years is how states look at what space does for weapon systems. If you look at the importance of GPS in terms of targeting for a lot of weapon systems now, it's quite interesting that states that employ such weapons are considering how to cope with degraded GPS environments. What if a nation blocks your GPS access or degrades it so that a weapon doesn't hit its intended target? So in some cases, that's states are looking to generate more modern and more innovative technological answers to that, but also it's forcing them to look backwards and in some cases revisit older technologies such as inertial guidance, miniaturizing atomic clocks, hardening existing systems within weapons to reduce that vulnerability. I don't know if Doug wants to add anything.
Yeah, on the threat side, I think the biggest threat is debris, obviously, as James mentioned, and either inadvertently or deliberately created, and most often inadvertently. On the ASAT side, obviously a number of countries have got active programs, both in terms of kinetic kill and denial of service. Quite a lot of that work obviously remains classified.
And then you after that, yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Fatmir Terziu. I'm from IBC News. My question is, according to the shocking image published from the Radio Free Europe about the Kosovan, which was dressed and posing himself as a high rank in the ISIS, and decapitating the soldier. And the next shocking image was in the social media about the buses filled with the young people leaving the border of Kosovo and traveling to different countries of Europe, seeking asylum. But the question is, They're going nowhere. What is the situation, please?
Before we answer, can we just go back to the question? Yes, you, sir? Anyone want to take that on? Okay, you on. Go on.
Hi, Mark Hookham from the Sunday Times. Your table earlier of the top 15 defence spenders showed the UK in fifth position. What are your projections for future years? How long is it expected to maintain that position, and when do you think it will start slipping down the table?
So, which country in particular?
Sorry, UK.
Gary? So I don't think we have a special answer to your question. We're not ignoring it, we just don't have a special answer to it. But yeah. Gary?
On the UK and the top 15, it's very difficult to say. I mean, obviously, it's futurology and also the role of exchange rates. I mean, the top 15 necessarily has to be in US dollars, and so exchange rate movements are going to affect those totals. So, I mean, my view is that the UK will probably remain there for a while. I mean, just looking at this now, I mean, France is about $10 billion less than the UK in sixth, so it's unlikely that the UK is going to lose $10 billion, you know, in the near future. Particularly with given growth rates at 2.5%. So generally, future projections are difficult. I would just say one thing, not in relation to the UK, but in relation to Japan and China on the spending front there. If you take the IMF forecasts for GDP in 2019, right, and you take the current rates of defense spending as a proportion of GDP, China goes to about just under half of Asian defense spending. Japan goes to about 10% of Asian defense spending. Now you compare that to 10 years previous, in 2010, China at 28%, just over a quarter, Japan at about 20%. So that's a really, really large fall off there, which is worth bearing in mind in that context.
You wanted a short answer to the
Yeah, just a very short general answer to what I think is the drift of your question. I mean, it is interesting that in the debates and the turmoil and the anguish about the Balkan wars in the 1990s, part of the discourse involved the fear of jihadism and terrorism, and of course, it is the case that Osama bin Laden spoke of Bosnia as one of the prime fields of jihad. But if we look at the situation in Europe today, I mean, there are many problems that come from the Balkans, but it's hard to say that the jihadist threat is one that we think about as being mainly centered on Balkans issues. It involves communities in Western Europe. So I don't know if that really responds to your question, but I think it's worth saying.
Yeah. And then we'll take just one more, I think, after that. Maybe from you, or yeah.
Okay, hi. Sam Nussi from Nikkei newspaper. Regarding the military spending in Asia, is for countries other than China, is the desire to prevent territorial incursions by other countries, obviously particularly China, the main factor that's driving military developments in those countries, such as Southeast Asia and Japan? Thanks.
Gary?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that. I mean, I think there are a multitude of reasons for Asian spending. Asian spending is often sort of talked about as really increasing very, very strongly. But if you actually look at, I mean, yes, there are increases, but relative to GDP growth in that part of the world, increases tend to be a bit lower than that. So average GDP growth over the last 5 years, I think, in Asia has been about 6.8%, something like that. Military spending over that time has averaged every year about 3 to 4%. So actually, as a proportion of GDP, or Asian GDP, military spending is actually falling. Where is it going? On a number of things. One of it's just going to be recapitalizing aging inventories. That's going to be part of it, investing in new technology, and also reorienting sort of capabilities from internal to external threats. So it's going to be a multitude of reasons that's driving this stuff. Thanks.
Quick one here.
Hi, I'm Zara from the BBC. I have a question about President Obama's recent blueprint with regards to tackling ISIS. He stressed the importance of a coalition and partnerships in fighting ISIS. How does this pan out militarily, and do you see this changing given the recent murder of the Jordanian pilot?
Toby?
Well, we know the coalition of the willing is dominated by the United States with sporadic, so the United Arab Emirates pulled out its air force, brought its air force back. The Jordanians, if anything, have ramped up their commitment to the fight against ISIS because of the horror surrounding its airmen. So this is a US-led and primarily US-delivered coalition with regional support, but more for, I would have thought, propaganda than strategic reasons, though with the Jordanians stepping up that may change. Overall, and we've had an internal discussion about this, and this is clearly the case in John's speech, air power has broken the momentum of the Islamic State and limited its expansion, but it's clearly a limited, beyond that, the reliance on proxies on the ground, the Peshmerga and the Iraqi military primarily, is not going to deliver, I think, major defeats against ISIS. So I think if this is a policy of containment, then I think it can be argued it will work. But if it's actually a policy of rollback, it's not sustainable in its current form.
Thank you very much indeed. The copies of the military balance press release are outside, and people will be available during the day for follow-up questions. Thank you.